Good afternoon. This panel is to discuss an extended horizon toward anticipatory governance and societal capacities for cooperation, including discussions of UNESCO's Global Anticipatory Policy Coalition, providing additional context for the exchange. We have today a wonderful panel of speakers who I'll introduce now, and then we will begin the discussion. Dr. Catherine Rhodes is currently a visitor and research affiliate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, University of Cambridge, where she was previously executive director. Catherine began her career in Peace Studies Department at Bradford University, contributing to a project on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention, and has since worked extensively on international governance of biosecurity and biological risks. Joshua POLCHAR is a strategic foresight practitioner and policy analyst at the OECD, currently working on the future of education and skills. Over the last 10 years at the OECD, he has led policy research and action learning on the value of futures thinking in organizational development. As an educator, Josh teaches students from bachelor's level to mature executives in scenario planning and futures literacy at M. Lyon Business School and at IE University Madrid. Clare Stark is head of futures literacy and foresight at UNESCO within the Management of Social Transformations program, where she leads capacity building efforts to support member states and public and private sector partners in using futures literacy and foresight to build resilience and inform inclusive, future-oriented policy development. Prior to this position, she served as UNESCO's sous-Sherpa for the G20. Dr. Fabio Rubio Scarano is the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies at the Museum of Tomorrow, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is also professor of ecology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and fellow of the Linnean Society of London. He has served the UN scientific panels on climate change and biodiversity and has received prestigious Brazilian literature prizes in the field of natural sciences. Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Carine DARTIGUEPEYROU, who is the president of the Société Française de Prospective and is an independent researcher, consultant, author, teacher, and conference speaker. She works as a strategic and futures analyst, advising large-size institutions for the last 20 years. She has worked at the international level on integration of Central and Eastern European countries into the European Union, as well as at the pan-European level, including the Bosnian War and Russia. Thank you so much, panelists, and we'll turn the discussion over to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, April. I'm going to start my comments by focusing on a question about when we're doing work on anticipating possible futures, whether we can avoid misuse of the outputs that are produced. So I think it will be interesting to see whether other panelists have come across similar issues in different areas, but the context I'm going to focus on is the Biological Weapons Convention. And anticipatory governance efforts in this area tend to focus on trying to understand how scientific and technological developments may support the aims of the Convention, which is to limit biology to peaceful purposes, or they may threaten those aims. So, for example, by providing an easier route to being able to produce a biological weapon. The coalitions that are formed around these issues combine international scientific policy and security communities. And in recent years, they've increasingly focused on using futures and horizon scanning methods in their reviews of scientific and technological developments. But when such areas or such exercises reveal areas of high misuse potential, that raises questions about how we should handle that information. Might open discussion increase the risks by drawing attention to opportunities to cause harm? And if so, are the benefits for anticipatory governance and for the open communication of science likely to outweigh those risks? So I'll just give a couple of recent examples that explore this and how it comes up. So the first is a pharmaceutical company that was invited to present its work on artificial intelligence-enabled drug discovery. realising as it developed that presentation that its model could easily be shifted to identification of novel biochemical warfare agents. So how to handle that was discussed in a 2023 paper called Dual Use of Artificial Intelligence-Powered Drug Discovery, and that aimed to raise awareness within the industry of those risks that could possibly arise from their work. The second example is in 2025, a group of leading scientists and biosecurity experts raised concerns about the possible future development of what's called mirror biology. It's believed to carry unprecedented risks of misuse and also accidental harms. It's thought to be at least a decade off in terms of the scientific developments, but the realisation is that it needs concerted efforts now in order to govern it effectively. The coalition around that topic is focused on consensus building that mirror biology research should simply not be pursued. But again, there are risks because they're drawing attention to the possibilities for deliberate harm in this area. Now, my point is not that I have the answer to that question, but it's to raise those issues around when we're exploring possible bad futures.
Next, we will have, Fabio, who I invite to share a few words. Thank you.
So thanks, April, and good afternoon, everyone, my panelist friends here. And I thought about sharing with you some of my experience in anticipatory governance with the UN panels of climate change and biodiversity. These are long processes, getting many academics together. In the case of the IPCC, in my times, we were more than 800 authors from 120 countries, and we were supposed to make these assessment reports about the state of climate. And then I worked for the panel on biodiversity, IPBES, also for a number of years. I think altogether between the two panels, some 10 years. And what the panels do is to produce these reports that are going to inform governments, society in general, private sector, NGOs, about the state of climate and biodiversity so that people take action as regards this data. Now, what I found frustrating during this experience that although it's a very interesting collective effort and you get to meet many very interesting people, you learn a lot in the process, the impression I have is that the more we make assessment reports, the more greenhouse gas emission we have, the more biodiversity loss we have. So although all that effort's done in an anticipatory fashion, no action is taken. So I have the impression that there is a disconnect, a decouple between understanding and acting, which for me has to do to some extent with an incapacity of feeling. We don't feel actually the changes that are happening, and therefore we don't act. Or there's some inertia, or we are too lazy, or we think it's not going to happen to us, as it happened in the case of the pandemic that was also foreseen some 7 years before it actually happened. And again, no action was taken. So that shows me that although nowadays we excel in forecasting and foresight strategies, sometimes I fail to see how that leads us to preventive action. So these are my first thoughts.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And I think we'll go to Josh, and then we'll open to the panelists to discuss these last few points.
Thank you so much. I'll bounce immediately off what Fabio just raised because we've written about it in a number of reports at the OECD. We call it the impact gap because there is no shortage of fantastic foresight work out there. I could name a few of the reports which had the idea of a pandemic in them, including the ones that I co-authored prior to 2020. So what happened in between and why did it happen? I think that's an even more important question to discuss. What prevents great futures work becoming anticipatory action? I think there are a few answers to that. One is around our institutions. One is around our own psychology and our mindset, the way we perceive the future. And one is around our collective psychology, let's say. So for our institutions, we know that it can be challenging to get stuff done in big organizations, whether they're international, government, and so on. And that's where the idea of anticipatory innovation governance, as has been written about by the OECD, becomes a really powerful lens through which to view these challenges. How do we set up institutions in the public sector to be receptive to knowledge about the future as it's emerging in the present? Some of those things involve agency and an authorizing environment which empower individuals in the public sector to recognize signs of the future, take them seriously, and put them into action where that's appropriate and proportionate. Say a couple of words about the psychology of it as well, because this really interests me as well. My catchphrase is, the future is not just what's ahead, it's what's in your head. We already have an idea of the future that's preconceived, whether we realize it or not. That's the kind of script that we're playing to, and it's constantly challenged, whether we like it or not. That means that we constantly have to revise our position, and we don't like that as humans because it's a cognitive dissonance thing. But there's also an issue with the way the future is conceived of, particularly in our Western societies. We think of the future as distant. We use timelines which create physical separation between ourselves and some other time. Somewhere else, somebody else's problem. I challenge in particular the cone diagram of the future, which presents me here and a whole bunch of futures over there, and allows me to push them away and think, well, I can't possibly imagine all of the crazy stuff that could happen in the future, therefore I won't even bother trying. And that's where I come to the collective psychology part of it. We find that even more difficult when we're around our peers and colleagues because there is a pressure to say the right thing. And only saying the right thing means that we usually say the expected thing. And I use the word expected in two senses of the word because in English it has those two senses. One is what we expect, as in what we anticipate to happen. But there's also expectation in terms of what our organization demands of us. I expect you to believe this about the future, the official version of the future. And that's a really difficult collective psychological barrier to overcome, especially because we tend to be punished worse when we've said something that goes against the grain, that's different from the rest of the flock, let's say. Because if that goes wrong, it's really easy to point the finger at the person who said something different. Whereas if I comply with what everyone else around me is saying, the groupthink, and it turns out to be wrong, then the blame is shared. So in our risk-averse organizations, which encourage us as individuals to be risk-averse as well, it's just not rational to think about and be the lone voice who is talking about those disruptive potential futures, the dual-use technologies, the potential pandemic, and so on, which are really important for us to act on, but we just don't get there for those reasons.
Thank you very much. Some great provocations. I'd love to start off with just an open question. Are there any immediate reflections to what you've heard today? Yes, go ahead, Claire.
I just wanted to build on what Josh was saying, because I think that the futures is increasingly politicized. If we think of what we can say, the tech oligarchy is very much pushing an agenda on how technology should be used and how it should be shaped. And I think this is really the importance of having a diversity of views on the futures encapsulating those diversities and making sure that those different perspectives on the futures, including the ethical perspectives. And this is also, of course, where UNESCO works in futures literacy and foresight, but also in terms of our work in the sciences. We have a bioethics committee that looks at emerging technologies. So artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and what are the ethical issues that are coming to the fore. So this is also anticipatory governance. But I think we need to help shape the futures and reduce the politicization of futures by sharing our vision of the future and having more of a diversity of views on the future. Maybe one area also that we're working on, we have the upcoming UNESCO Science Decade in July, and we are bringing together also indigenous peoples to have also information and a reflection on how indigenous knowledge can be integrated into the work that we're doing on science policy. We've seen that a little bit in the climate change discussions, but it hasn't come through fully enough. And we also want to not interrogate, I don't like this word, but we also want to encourage them to share with us their ideas of the futures, because I think this is an area where we need to expand also the representation of indigenous peoples in the futures dialogues. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So I picked up on a few different points there. It seems that you, Josh, suggest that working that in large systems, the motivation is to comply for various different reasons, financial reasons being important, as well as going with the group status, etc. I'm wondering about, however, when one is outside of the system, is it easier to work on restructuring anticipatory governance from within a system, which is an international organization, such as you're part of, Clare, or you, Josh? Can one have agency to exert some sort of small pressures to shape systems in a way that's more oriented toward anticipatory governance, that's looking for the future and making action so that the future is better according to the values that you have for what that better is, right? Or is it outside of the system actors, students perhaps, who, since they don't have the same risks, are they able to exert pressure and create change? So this is not an easy question, but I think just to start us off, how does change happen in big systems when, and just to put an example on this thought, I recently was at a conference in which space policy, France's space policy was being discussed, and my question to the speaker was, given the governance issues, the bodies in space that are highly problematic, that the space pollution, traffic control issues, lower Earth orbit, etc. Given all these concerns, why is the policy to go and join and add more space bodies in space when big issues haven't been addressed yet? So this isn't, so the answer was, if we want to exert control or influence, we've got to be there. So even if being there means perhaps complicating the space, perhaps increasing risk for potential conflict in the future. So this isn't to step too far outside of our theme today, but it is something that came to mind, and I'd love to hear some comments about how to do that.
Oh, there was so much in there. I sometimes say in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way that as a foresight practitioner, I spend 80% of my time making the case for the value of what I do and 20% of the time doing it. This panel is super refreshing because so far I've heard nothing but foresight and futures are super impactful, almost to the point that we have more impact than we know what to do with. When we're talking about anticipating future technologies, when we're talking about the future as a playing field of power that people are literally competing to make their mark on, that's encouraging for a foresight practitioner, but of course I'm very conscious of the responsibility that that brings with it. So it's a refreshing thing to hear, but it's also a wake-up call to us as a field that we have some important responsibilities to consider. Your question, April, was about influencing systems. So this is my opportunity to do a bit of product placement for my latest co-authored OECD report, An Ecosystems Approach to Curriculum Change. We looked at how policymakers wishing to reform national curriculum programs can do so while taking into account the ecosystem in which they already operate and in which that reform is destined to take place. In other words, it's not enough to write the policy document, you also have to consider the teachers, the other actors, the parents, the schools, the exams, the textbooks, and above all else, the students who are going to be the main beneficiaries and whose views can actually really benefit the design of such a curriculum. Your question was about inside versus outside. I'd say both and I think that because we operate in these ecosystems, almost never is there an opportunity for a small number of individuals to design a system in such a way that it is so impactful and determines the trajectory of a whole system for hundreds, thousands, millions of people. That's really kind of founding of a nation moments. That's revolution moments. More often where we find ourselves is as individuals and sometimes as organizations within a big system that is highly complex and has a lot of inertia, feedback loops that we can't predict, other actors whose responses we can't predict. So in the report, we talk about this idea of collective impact and collective action, which is a field of study and really centers on how individuals can form coalitions, come together with organizations, create common purpose, and just nudge that system in the direction that they want to see in a way that builds democratic legitimacy, because that's super important too, and ensures that a variety of actors are heard.
Thank you. That was a great transition for Claire. Would you mind speaking about the coalition initiative at UNESCO?
Sure, thanks, April. And also just maybe just to bounce off this global and local connection, I think that we do need to reinforce. I think one of the good examples was during the formulation of the 2030 Agenda, because this is really the first time that there was such a participatory approach. Thousands of people were consulted on this agenda, what should inform the goals, and this was reflected in what governments do, and not just at national level, but at regional level and at community level. So I think that's a really good example. Maybe just two other examples from UNESCO are the Ethics of AI recommendation that was adopted by 194 member states, and the recent Ethics of Neurotechnology recommendation. So for all of these recommendations, we not only consult our bioethics committee, but a number of experts in different regions of the world to inform these recommendations. And these are then translated into national policies. So just making a little bit that, that link there. But the purpose behind the Global Anticipatory Policy Coalition, and also working very much with OECD and of course WEF, but is really to expand this capacity to other countries beyond, for example, the OECD membership, to countries, middle income and developing countries, where they have approached us to support them in building their capacity. So how are we doing that? Well, one way we're also doing that is by working with the large network that UNESCO has. So of course we have this excellent network, and I have one of our chairs sitting next to me right here, is our UNESCO chairs on futures literacy and foresight that focus on a range of different areas, you know, from futures of education to futures of heritage and museums. So we're really working with them also to translate some of the scientific evidence into the policymaking, and that brings me back to the purpose and objective of the Management of Social Transformations program, which is an intergovernmental program. So we're working directly with member states, again, trying to make that link with the scientific evidence, what is happening on the ground, and how that informs policy. So we are going to be launching this Global Anticipatory Policy Coalition on the 29th of September at the Management of Social Transformations Forum in Paris at UNESCO. So we invite you all to come. It will be open, and we will have a whole social transformations week where we will be discussing different issues, including how do we enhance what we consider knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, but how humanities, we were talking about change, how does behavioral science, for example, help to influence change? So we will be discussing a bit of a number of these issues on that occasion. So happy to provide more information on that too.
Thank you very much, Claire. Are there any comments or reflections?
Maybe I can speak from the local side, because my exposure and experience is not so much about big systems, you know, as UNESCO or, you know, OECD, more involved at the national level and territories. And I would like to remind us that today we are trying to see the benefits of future studies, foresight, anticipation. And one of the major benefits is that it could be transformative. You're right. That could be transformative. Such an exercise can be transformative. And I think today we have a big difference, I can see, between big systems, you know, exercise that are required, absolutely required in terms of ethics of AI, etc. But at the local level, at the territory level, there's a lot going on. And foresight there can be very transformative. The discussion today is about peace. We have today territories that are really involved in trying to enforce, for example, social cohesion. How to make sure it's not peacemaking, but it's not far from, you know, decreasing conflicts and, you know, having cultures, different ethical people speaking with each other and inventing the future. So I would like to think and to say maybe that the first condition to remind us is that anticipation and foresight has to be transformative. And for that, I know that, you know, sometimes people are divided about that, but I do think that we have to have decision makers involved. We have to have panel stakeholders, you know, coming from civil society, administrative people, but as well politicians, because sometimes, you know, politicians are very active on this front. So that's what I wanted to say, that, you know, we should not forget the benefits of having, you know, foresight as being transformative. And the second thing is that we should not forget neither that with anticipation and foresight, we can have desirable future. We can imagine and we can build desirable future. And I have not heard since this morning this notion of desirable future. We can put the ethics And I would like to say, if futures become politics, then that's great for me. I'm a political scientist. But, you know, I think it is a hope, because it is a hope that we will work on establishing the conditions to have and to think about the nature of the future we want to have. So I see that maybe from a different angle of your experience as an opportunity and a hope.
Thank you very much. So I have a few reflections which are anticipatory processes are not value neutral. It seems to me that there is an ethic, perhaps largely unspoken, by people in the futures community, those working on anticipation, that they want to create a better future. I don't know that that necessarily means that in the process that's always the case. There's also maybe there are good intentions, but I sometimes wonder about as you're saying, desirable future. It's fantastic to have an image of a future that you want to work toward. But the question is, what is the role of those images in actually creating action, in increasing hope or perhaps decreasing hope? I think in my own background have seen can go both ways. If one is working on a process and thinking about, for instance, in this sphere of peace, it can be very, in some ways, simple to say, ideally, the future would be one in which there is no violence, one in which people are all able to eat, they all have access to health care, plants and trees, and the ecological world is well cared for. That comes up time and time again in these desirable future models. But then the question is, sometimes it can be tricky to understand how to then work from the gap. And in these large systems, anticipatory governance, international coalitions, sometimes I wonder, and I know I'm putting a lot on the table, so please feel free to just respond to whatever captures your attention. I wonder about an initiative, for example, to welcome in more Indigenous voices into the conversation. How does one go from listening to then integrating so that it's more than just we did our duty, we checked the box, we invited the people, but then we continue on with our own agenda, tiny bit modified. How can external voices shape and change in ways that are effective for the agreed upon desirable outcomes? So again, that was a lot, but since we're talking about anticipatory governance and coalitions for peace, I think it makes sense to ask some of these questions.
Can I go one step back? I was thinking biologically about anticipation. And anticipation is a process that's highly dependent on memory and attention. Memory, our relationship with the past, attention with the present, and anticipation, the images that we create of the future. And I learned by working with plants that beings who cannot move much, at least not horizontally, that they have, for that reason, they have to pay a lot of attention. And in doing so, they can activate their ancestral memory, which is often bodily, hormonal. And this combination makes them anticipate very well. They can sense what's about to happen and therefore adjust morphologically, physiologically to what's coming. working with some indigenous peoples in our country, in Brazil, I also noticed that their anticipatory process for many of the communities, in Brazil we have 305 different indigenous nations, and so I worked only with a few of them in Western Amazon. And all of them use dreams to anticipate. So they even dream collectively. They discuss what they're going to dream with, and then in the next morning they make a decision based on that. So to pay attention, the case of the plants, and to dream well, we cannot live, I think, the modern society in the speed that we live. The speed that we live, and we do that because we are measured by our productivity, our performance, our competitiveness, and that creates a whirlwind that puts you into automatic mode. And when you go into automatic, you don't pay enough attention, and you remember nothing, and therefore you anticipate poorly, which goes back to what I said before. Although we know what's about to come because foresight and forecast techniques are so sophisticated nowadays, we just don't take action. We are too tired, oftentimes. And this tiredness, I think, is something that should be circumvented so that we can truly anticipate in order to be able to take at least preventive action.
Yes, I want to continue on that because I would like to bring to the discussion Hartmut Rosa. Hartmut Rosa, who talks about social acceleration. And he said we actually, and you know that anticipation, we can play with the intelligence of different temporalities, you know, the short, medium, long term, very long term. And what I think is very useful is that Hartmut Rosa, what does he say? He says that we need to imagine much more social energy. Social energy being, you know, when we, for example, feel about or think about the future of a country, when we envision this country after the war, we need, and that's my experience in Bosnia or even in Ukraine or whatever, is that we need to apprehend reconciliation. Because if we don't think of reconciliation, that is to say people who are from the same culture, who suddenly became warriors, you know, who killed each other, and that they will continue to live on the same territory. If we do not anticipate this reconciliation, I think there's no way we can settle an agreement. We cannot reach peace. So you see the future here, ethical future, it's not something like very nice to have. You know, it can bring memory from the past, but it can bring also memories of the future. And memories of the future is actually making explicit the ethical future we want to apprehend. That is to say, making explicit the values, you know, values as being defined as what is important for us individually, collectively, politically, in terms of a system. And again, I think with foresight, we have a wonderful tool, you know, but we need to work much more, I think, on the conditions of working together and establishing the cooperation right at the beginning and visioning, ethically speaking, the future we want to build. This morning, we spoke a lot about the new paradigm. This is the new paradigm. You know, foresight allows us to reach another level of consciousness. And I think that's the challenge, I think, for peacemakers or people who implement, is to reach this kind of cooperation.
So I think I would push back slightly on foresight being able to enable a different level of consciousness. Mm-hmm. It seems that it's I think I would characterize foresight more as a lens that can add another layer of analysis to the way that we think about decision making. That's an important lens, but that seems, it would be interesting to, we could talk about that further, yes, exactly. Claire, did you want to come in on some of the points from earlier?
Well, I wanted to come in on this. I think you started out with the importance of imagination. And of course, this goes to UNESCO's work on futures literacy and foresight. And I saw Reel Miller earlier, whom you all know, which was one of the leaders on futures literacy, and it was coined by UNESCO in 2012. But what is interesting, I think, about futures literacy is that it opens our minds. It challenges our assumptions, and it helps us to think creatively and imaginatively. And I think this was very well kind of documented and also discussed when we had the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, and how his Ministry of the Future was very impactful about how we think about transforming Mars, which we see certain individuals wanting to do now. So it has influenced our collective consciousness. So I think the role of the imagination and what we can do through futures literacy in particular, but also through foresight in helping to build that imaginatory process, which I don't think has yet been taken up sufficiently in different political levels yet. And I think that is also a bit of the challenge.
Thank you. That's interesting. I had the chance to attend that event, and it's true that maybe this connects to an earlier question about those who are inside governance, large international organizations, thinking about these issues, and then those who are in the artistic space, those who are in the area of storytelling, maybe focusing on storytelling that's oriented toward the future in a thoughtful way that is easily accessible is just one avenue that could be explored further by those who have that creative capacity, particularly since it's challenging to talk about big concepts, but suddenly when you pick up a story, you're turning the page, or you're pressing next, and it can be a really interesting way to get some of these, to expand creativity, as you mentioned, creativity and imagination. So thank you.
At my old apartment, there was a lady who would come along the street every evening at 10 p.m. and unload a sack full of grain onto the street. And the pigeons would go absolutely bananas. They would have the time of their lives. And she did it every evening so predictably that the pigeons learned to anticipate. And I was at the beginning of my career as a strategic foresight practitioner, and I really questioned myself. I was like, why am I doing this discipline that even a bunch of pigeons can do? And how did I resolve that tension in my mind? I resolved it by realizing that strategic foresight is a discipline. Maybe it's a form of consciousness, maybe it's something else, but that's the way I see it. We know that babies, more or less from birth, are able to do some primitive form of counting. They're able to get from 1 to 2 and recognize the difference between oneness, two-ness, and even three-ness. So there is some innate ability to do mathematics that we are endowed with. Does that mean that we're able to do all the things that some of the world's greatest mathematicians were able to do, like Ada Lovelace or Albert Einstein? No, they required education, experience, and training. We know that pigeons and plants can anticipate, and humans can anticipate too, but that's our, if you like, innate and kind of baseline ability to anticipate. If we take futures seriously as a discipline, then we have this great opportunity to cultivate in each of us some advanced anticipatory capacities, which can be very powerful, which, as I've said before, carry a great responsibility and can be used for good or nefarious purposes. I'm not one of the people who thinks that futures studies are inherently a force for good or will bring world peace on their own. They can be used for all kinds of purposes. Don't have to be political, but they can. Don't have to be purposeful, but they can. And there are people who are using futures and foresight for political purposes and for some very nefarious purposes. So those of us who want to see futures used for good, used for peaceful purposes, had better get really good at doing it, because there are other people who are competing with us for the opportunity to shape the future in a way that they want to see and that many of us would disagree with very profoundly.
Thank you very much. I have a concrete example of my train ride here today. I looked out the window and I saw an AI, I don't know, AI assistant images.
I saw the same
the
one,
same
yeah.
images, yeah. And the heading was something like, this new assistant can be your marketing strategist and also publish online for you and also do all these things. And my instant thought was, that's not the future I want. It's not. I would like for people to be thinking. I'd like for them to be doing the strategies and a little bit of assistance or help from AI, sure. And not everyone here in this room has to agree with me. But my instant thought was about, okay, is this the future that I personally want and envision? There were other pieces to this. One image was the strategist was a young man. It was a cartoon. And then the assistant was a young woman. And instantly I had the alarm bells. Well, are we going to just reproduce the same kind of social issues that we have now in this digital space, which, as you said, these technocratic oligarchies, I believe is the term you used, are tech oligarchs. I'm not sure that we should be letting a few set of people decide these kinds of futures. But since you're a panel of experts on anticipatory governance, me as a person in a train saying this isn't the future I want about this particular issue, is there a way you would recommend for me to engage in order to shape or influence policies in ways that are more aligned with the future I want, and where would I look to do that? So, and thinking of these biological weapons, I mean, I don't want a future with mass problematic biological weapons that are, I'm sorry, the term you used was?
The mirror biology. Was that?
Mirror biology, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that there is to step back to the coalitions, and it also comes to the inside-outside point. We're actually in some ways fortunate around the Biological Weapons Convention that it's quite a weak convention in some senses. It doesn't have an international organisation associated with it. So the Chemical Weapons Convention has the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons with about 500 staff. The Biological Weapons Convention has a 3-person implementation support unit that is formally not an international organisation. But that means that a lot of activity does take place in the space around it and outside of it. And that's where coalitions and things like scientists in particular, both in terms of there may be regulation that comes that you don't like because it's, policymakers will put a ban on something not understanding what's actually going on with the science. So you don't want that to happen. So you do want to be engaging and making sure it's kind of reasonable levels of regulation. But on the other hand, also kind of the engagement so that they are aware of the risks of their research. And so, yes, it's helping people to understand that there are routes into this. International governance can seem so far off from lived reality. But you probably, in a case of a scientist working in a lab, you're probably employed by someone. You're probably part of a professional association, or there's someone who can represent you at that level. So you can work through those bodies to engage. And there's also, and I think this connects with UNESCO a bit, the Global Young Academy, which deliberately is getting young scientists, I think up to the age of 30, to start engaging in these processes and being the next generation to support that kind of activity.
Thank you. And how do people find out about coalitions? What kind of keyword search is that?
Oh, so it will vary, but I would go to look for your National Science Academy to start off with. So in the UK, that's the Royal Society. Don't know the French version. The US, it's the National Academies for Science. There's also, if you wanted to get started at that level, the Inter-Academy Panel, which is the international coalition of all those academies. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone on this side want to jump in?
Maybe just also jumping in, if you're thinking about somebody that wants to get involved, that's in the train in these discussions. We have a number of networks to work with young scientists, for example, young female scientists, but also we have the Associated Schools network with thousands of schools. And I think that is a good entry point. With one of our chairs, we're looking at how we can develop a model framework for futures literacy, so teaching futures literacy. So I think it begins at a very young age. I think my colleague Keith was here earlier from the education sector and working on futures of education too. But I think it begins it's for all levels of education to enhance this anticipatory capacity. So we have a number of networks, the ASP School Network. We have our chairs, which work with museums, which I think is a great place to bring in people from the street, have them involved in futures literacy labs. This is a growing area as well. A lot of museums are very interested in opening their doors. Some are focused on the future, like the one in Rio, or the Futurium. But I think also museums that we have today, traditional museums, because as somebody was saying, linking the past to the future is a really important dimension as well, I think, for helping to people think about their identity and their culture. And of course, we promote respect for cultural diversity, and this is a key element of futures literacy and foresight at UNESCO. But I think museums can be a key actor as well in this field. And we're working with ICROM and some of our chairs to expand that capacity.
Okay, thank you.
April, you asked, how do we respond in a way that activates our futures consciousness and our own anticipatory capacity or even anticipatory agency when we're presented with images of the future? You did it. And I wonder how many hundreds of thousands of people go past the same advert as you every day and don't do that. They're just served that version of the future. Maybe they ignore it. Maybe they internalize it, or they internalize a bit of it. And that's how we unconsciously allow other people, other actors with other interests that we may disagree with to shape the future within us. The future isn't just what's ahead, it's what's in our head. And we get to choose what that is.
I have a PhD in future studies. So I should be able to be a little bit critical thinking in this space.
Right, but how many of the people going past that advert have a PhD in future studies?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Most of them don't.
Yeah.
So how do we increase anticipatory awareness and beyond perhaps the workshop space as well, because those are limited in scale. If you're aware of any ideas, sure, go ahead, Carine.
Yes, I think it's interesting, very interesting, this discussion, because obviously we need to have starting with a younger age, okay? But we have to remember we are going through a demographic transition. We are all getting older. It's not only in Western Europe, and it's all over the place. And I think that we should as well provide some help to adults and empower adults. And I was starting at the beginning saying that, the foresight can be transformative. you know. So I think we need really to empower people at all levels, you know, starting from young people, you know, people like at universities, but as well older people, you know, to give them this capacity to contribute to imagine other futures. And there's no one future, there are different futures, and trying to really understand what is important to them. And again, I think this empowering, it's not, you know, it's really the idea to develop capacities, capabilities. It's not going to school like we used to, you know, it's really giving this capacity to really apprehend future on a daily basis, on a very pragmatic aspect.
Would you mind giving an example of how to increase capacity?
My work, one of my work actually, is working with local collectivities. You know, it's kind of called in France département, we know, which is not that local, but kind of regional level. And it's been 14 years that, you know, we have a very active policy in terms of culture of anticipation. 14 years that we are actually empowering politicians, empowering administrative people, because the administrative people have a great responsibility in the longer run. Because as you may know, you know, politicians are there for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, you know, at most. But then the issue is how administrative people can continue to implement and have this discussion about futures. So I think with, of course, civil society, with universities, etc., etc. So this is a very simple example, but it is working. And I think that most, again, territories are really developing this kind of, it's not really training, but it's really, it's laboratory. We call that public, you know, public innovation, but voilà.
Merci. Go ahead.
So when I was a child, I loved going to the dentist. I had this really nice dentist who was super kind and would joke all the time. And his favorite running gag was that he couldn't wait for my wisdom teeth to come through so he could pull them out. The joke worked because for him that would be a fairly routine procedure that he was used to doing. He was highly qualified to do it, and that's how he made his money. Whereas for me, it would be a novel experience, maybe quite scary, unpleasant, take a lot longer than I wanted it to, and probably leave me with a bill at the end. In this metaphor, the dentists are the strategic foresight practitioners, the people with the PhD in it who make their money doing big, ambitious, and sometimes scary interventions in strategic foresight for organizations who then pick up the bill at the end. And we wonder why it's difficult for us to sell the work that we're doing to those organizations. So I like to extend the metaphor a little bit further and say that for most people, most of the time, especially politicians who don't have a lot of time, their experience of strategic foresight should be less like teeth pulling and more like teeth brushing. 3 minutes a day, twice a day. Think about the futures you're being served. You go past an advert. Which past patterns is that activating in my mind? What does it remind me of? What memories of the future is it creating for me? What is it evoking? And what would I like to see instead? And then most importantly, what do I do to make that happen? That's the 3 minutes of foresight version that I think a lot of us could benefit a lot more from.
Thanks. That was a very effective metaphor. Go ahead, Claire.
Just picking up on that as well, but I think if we want to expand this capacity, we need also to democratize the futures, right? So by making capacity building workshops, trainings also available on open access resources. Because if you want to get more people interested, more people involved, it should be readily accessible as a global good.
Thank you. Fabio, is this one of the reasons that you're with the Museum of the Future to embody. Could you share with us more about what your dream was and what your vision was for this museum and how this feeds into anticipatory work?
Yeah, well, it's actually it's a museum of tomorrow. It's not a museum of the future, and we make a difference between two words. We think that tomorrow is something that is inside you. It's not out there, and somehow equates with hope, agency, faith, confidence in yourself, in life. And then we, after having worked so many years in these panels, it was a fantastic experience. As I mentioned before, I had the impression that it was not effective in terms of making changes. And then when I was invited for this museum experience, which started by building this chair with UNESCO, I really thought I could, well, talk to a different type of audience and bring to people some of the stuff I had learned with plants, in terms of behavior, really. And now, so to give you just an idea, in 3 years of activities of our UNESCO chair, we have reached more than 2,000 people with Futures Literacy Laboratories. And that includes a number of our visitors in the museum. And to give you an idea, it's the most visited museum in South America. 25% of our visitors, it's the first museum they have ever been to. 40% are non-frequent museum goers. So we are really reaching a different type of audience than I used to get at the university. And also at the university, a fantastic experience too. And with them, we discuss a lot the futures of education. And they often see how far away we are from some of the desires that young people have in terms of our own practice there. And one of the things that I learned during these years of activity of the chair was exactly, I think, about desire, which is a word that you guys mentioned several times here. And I think desire, it's really difficult because I think that's where peace lies in the end. You have your desire, somebody else has another desire, and how to find a way where both desires can be achieved without one impacting negatively the other is part of the process for peace. And then I was so interested in desire that I started to study it. And the first thing I came across was Confessions by St. Augustine. And then I learned that Hannah Arendt did her PhD thesis called Love in St. Augustine in 1926, if I'm not mistaken. It's a beautiful thesis because she takes out a lot of the religious layer and she discusses mainly desire. And the central point there is that, and Augustine said that he said that there were two types of desire. One desire, in both types, they are essentially related to love. And then one of them is what he called unconditional love. It's open, and it doesn't have anything to do with possession. And the love that guides you to possession is what he called the mistaken love, something like that would be in English. And the parallel she makes is that we, early 20th century, and I think nowadays it's probably worse, is that we are a society that's very much connected with consumption. So deep down, we are driven to possess. And that takes place not only with objects, but we transfer that to other beings. And then if our relationship with desire is selfish in that sense, that's the opposite of peace. And then sometimes in the labs that we do, I see a bit of everything, but there's one that always comes to my mind that I used as example several times. People here may have heard I speak about it. Was working It was actually in the previous COP of climate that took place in the Amazon in Brazil, in Belém. We did a laboratory for about 25, 30 people who work in the countryside with bioeconomy. They are in this transition from an old style agriculture to a more sustainable one, more diverse. And in there was a group of 5 or 6 indigenous people too who were also into that practice. And I was fascinated to see for the first time after 2,000 people that when these guys came to the final moment of the laboratory, it's about action. What are you going to do with all those desires and probabilities and alternatives? And they all, they started saying what they would do. Tomorrow morning, I will do this and this and that. And I really love that because everything they said was really open in that sense of being unconditional. It was clearly not for selfish purposes, but it was open. And I think this state of mind, if we can somehow, I think, bring that into our practices and discussion, I think it's going to be helpful because deep down, it's all about values, isn't it? That comes before, I think, some of the, and I think desire is essential. So I strongly recommend Hannah Arendt, Loving St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. That sounds like a really interesting read. Hannah Arendt has some great thoughts just in general. So I think this reminded me, and this is to tie this conversation a little bit more, anchor it back to peace. I read a study during the course of my research that looked at the idea of if one thinks peace is far into the future, how close or far do people tend to frame peace? And essentially, the more peace was framed as farther away, the more likely people judged it to be. And I've been thinking about that paper for the last 3 years. And the reason is I wonder about this connection to, do we think that because of the maybe the media landscape or social media, the context in which we find ourselves, because the focus is on the things that are generally not going well, how does that feed the idea that the possibility of peaceful futures is very far off, and therefore if it's very far off, maybe if I do something today, it's not going to be that meaningful. I wonder about this connection between how we push out the horizon for some good things, like a peaceful future, how that changes our relation to agency or feeling of responsibility. So this was what your pointed question about, okay, what is tomorrow? How are we going to shape tomorrow? I think that's really, really nicely put. And then my second question is, was there a recommendation from Hannah about shifting from this possessive love, which I like the framing of it's being antithetical to peaceful pursuits. Did she have a recommendation for how people shift to a more expansive version of embracing others?
Well, she doesn't explicitly, but I make a connection between that and what you just mentioned allowed me to talk a little bit about utopia as a concept. And oftentimes we tend to think of utopia as some place that you want to arrive at. And I think it's not that. It's like tomorrow. It's something that's inside you. So you carry it with you. And the fact that some of it seems far away, let's call peace an utopia in that sense. It's not exactly a place, but it's a state that we imagine, and it somehow works as a compass. And if in our day-to-day life, we are peaceful in our actions. We are living that peace here in the present. And then I think stuff like peace, eternity, sustainability, we carry, they are not necessarily reachable, but we carry them in us. And as we carry them and as we practice them every day, or we try to, we may not see it in our lifetime. But I think it's comforting to think that somebody might. Because these things, they are a path, a rather broad one, that it's quite flexible inside. And that's why sometimes it takes so long. And the unconditional love, in my view, is to not want to possess this desire at some place. Is to understand that if somebody sees it in the future, that's good enough.
I'm not quite so rosy in my outlook, I'm afraid, but I get to the same place. Whatever the weather. Construal level theory in psychology suggests that we equate time and distance. And when we think about a long horizon, we also think a time horizon, we also think about something being really far away. And that creates a lack of empathy between ourselves today and our future selves. And also a feeling of, well, I don't have to do anything about it now. And I think that's a really big problem when it comes to peacemaking. The next 3 decades, the next 3 years, and the next 3 minutes are all part of the same thing. They're not separate time horizons as we often present them when we draw them out. They're concentric circles rather than different points on a line. Peace is really difficult. It's ugly. It requires horrible compromises, lots of hard work, and significant sacrifices. And we know that from some of the successful and unsuccessful peacemaking processes that we've seen in our lifetimes. I'm thinking personally about the Good Friday Agreement, which largely put a stop to decades of violence in Northern Ireland. And as part of the negotiations of that process, a lot of people had to make sacrifices and had to put up with what they perceived as enormous injustices. So it wasn't an easy thing. It took a lot of effort from multiple parties. Yes, they were guided by an image of a peaceful future. They had positive visions, so I agree with you there, Fabio. But it also took that grind, the hard work of what are we going to do in the next 3 minutes as I enter this negotiating room with someone who I have been brought up to detest. How does that feed into a process that's going to take a few more months and a few more years and produce peace in that way? So I come back to this, the future is not distant, it's already in the making, and who is going to contribute the most to shaping the future in the making depends so much on power dynamics and agency and our own willingness and ability to act and not just let it be taken away from us.
Thank you. Claire.
Maybe just to add on this issue also of hope. I mean, we tend to focus on the polycrises, the meta-crises, digital disruption, demographic transitions, instead of really seen as a polytunity, which I think with futures thinking and foresight, and as we look to how do we create peace, is changing a bit the discourse so that people feel that they have agency, that they can make a difference. I mean, we've seen rising levels of climate anxiety, for example, that's affecting people's mental and physical well-being. So this has now become sort of an issue for people's health. So I think, bringing peace to people and having a discourse that focuses on how they can be agents of change is really important. And I think there's some good examples, like the Montfleur examples after apartheid in South Africa. You know, this is a good example of how you bring communities together and focus on what do we want the future to look like. So I think we should focus more on the positive examples if we want to instill peace and social cohesion of societies.
Thank you. For those who don't know about the Montfleur scenarios, these were scenarios that took place in South Africa around the struggles, the apartheid struggles. The people invited into the room were high level. They represented different groups, including who had very different visions for their ideal futures. People who were on all sides of the spectrum, and you can imagine that the scenarios produced by certain groups were very distasteful to other groups, but they agreed to work together. They agreed to talk to each other candidly and openly, and they produced a number of scenarios about desirable futures, probable futures, a worst case scenario, and those were released to the South African public. It seems from some reporting that it was influential, that it was mentioned that, okay, this version of the future where everything collapses and we all can't stand each other and we go to civil war and we kill each other, that's not the future we want, okay. This future where it's the white nationalists that dominate all the other people, that's not the future we want, okay. So they worked through to a future that wasn't a perfect, ideal, desirable future for all. And maybe Tanya has more hands-on knowledge and experience. If you'd like to add anything to that, there have been several scenario processes since then in South Africa, including the Dinokeng scenarios, which was about the post-apartheid period and what it could look like to move forward into a future that had a pretty challenging past history. So, so this is just one example of these scenario work that involved people who came from various different backgrounds to talk about how to move forward into a future that was the best negotiated alternative. I'm about to say BATNA for those who are strategic negotiation nerds, I suppose. I think, Carine, I might have taken the moment away from you, so please jump in.
I just wanted to say that I really I share very much the thoughts of Claire, because when she says we have challenges, but you know, by finding solutions, we become agent of our own destiny. And personally speaking, I'm working a lot with a curious values development perspective, which is a tool. There are other tools because, you know, values technology was, I think, used in South Africa. There are other tools, but I find that, you know, behind peace, we know that we have not only one worldview. Okay, we discussed this morning that actually for people, peace is conflict, etc. You have someone who he's not safe, you know, physically speaking, you know, that's one worldview. You know, someone who has no food and water, as we see in Gaza, it's another worldview. Someone who has not the right information, you know, like in Russia, it's not, cannot be in peace. We have as well the worldviews of having respect and being able to listen, to establish a dialogue. This is possible, but I remind you that 70% of the worldwide population lives under authoritative regime. So we have, you know, we have a context which is changing, and I think that it's very important to understand the different perspective, different values behind all these worldviews, and to try to establish synergies. Because again, I think that's one of the benefits of, you know, foresight, of anticipation, of literacy of futures, you know, being able to really vision where we want to go, what place we want to give to human rights, for example. But it has to be used in order to try really to get some synergy. I think that's one of the main issues.
Thank you. I think that we're coming close to time, so I would like to do a short round. If each of the panelists could share a reflection or perhaps an idea for how to act tomorrow in order to bring about a future that's a little bit closer to the vision of peace. Is there some sort of action that you yourself would like to engage in, or that you would recommend to someone you're close to, for example, without naming them, of course? So I will start with Josh, and we'll move around to Carine. Thank you.
All right, I want to tie up some of the things I heard right at the beginning and towards the end. Towards the end, we talked about generalizing futures capabilities, open futures, and making it accessible to all. That shouldn't be confused with publishing all the futures content that we create. Futures are not absolute because we don't have access to them yet. Some say the future doesn't even exist yet. It's definitely still in the making. And what it means to each of us is different. Future studies, in my view, should be purposeful. That means that they should be tailored and they should be sensitive. They should be sensitive because otherwise they're probably not doing any good. They probably don't mean much. So if you're going to go into a futures process, yes, benefit from skills that we can all learn. And I wouldn't be a teacher to universities if it wasn't the case that I believe we should be generalizing these capabilities. But keep the scenarios to yourself. And if necessary, classify them. Keep them internal within the organization, because you're going to learn something from those that no one else could, and quite possibly no one else should.
Interesting. Thank you, Josh. Claire.
Thanks, April. I would say as my insights is that we need to expand the capacity with society and also at the government level. So working with schools on futures literacy pedagogy, but also opening up new spaces. I think we have some really good examples with some of the museums, and seeing how we can work with society in a participatory manner to look at some of the big questions. As we think about the post-2030 agenda, what does society, this is the future we want. You know, it was discussed at the UN, there's a declaration on future generations. So now we need to turn this into action, and we need to involve different voices in determining the future that we want. And I think the post-2030 agenda is a good opportunity to do that. I would also say that with the Global Anticipatory Policy Coalition, this is a multi-stakeholder platform. So we want everyone to be involved. We want to enhance the institutional capacity of governments, because that's how we can change policies. And we are called the management of social transformations. So we want to encourage governments to make policies that promote social change. So I would also encourage everyone to get involved in this coalition and building on other existing coalitions. So that's my final thoughts. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. And it just came to my mind, a friend of us from Nigeria, Bayo Akomolafi, he says that, he has this sentence, times are urgent, slow down. So I think that's my strong recommendation to all of us. I think that if there is a real revolution to be made, it's a revolution in our use of time.
Thank you.
I think what I would pick up on, and I think came from Fabio's first comments, is if you're going to do anticipatory governance, then consider properly the inputs and the outcomes of this in advance, and don't bother if you're not going to do that properly. So put proper resourcing in the first place so that it can be a meaningful exercise, but also have some actions come out of it, because otherwise you'll end up 20 years down the line with lots of lovely reports and no actions. It's just a kind of frustrating and meaningless process.
Thank you.
And I would say just think whether you're young, very young, old, very old, bring the best you can to the planet.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a very interesting conversation. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, panelists. I'd like to open this to questions. We have time for more than just a few. And then after that, we'll move to Fabienne's remarks that will attempt to summarize our many thematic paths that we took today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing that. In the meantime, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do ask.
Please.
Please.
Go ahead. Please. Really.
Okay. Thank you for really great panel. My let's say comment and consideration is related to governance aspect. And recently I work with epidemics, pandemics, and we work with the governance during crisis. And we analyzed recently 54 documents coming from UN and OECD, and basically looking for anticipatory governance, but participatory mechanism in decision making. When we analyze these 54 documents, it's interesting because almost every document agreed that participation is important. Some documents more recently, especially OECD, include anticipation. However, the participation on the decision by society, communities, is not explicit in any document. Then and when you talk about peace, for example, if you ask to society about what they want peace. If you ask the Americans, at least 75% of the Americans against the war with Iran. However, the decision is not there. And education, of course, needs to be done for our politicians, but for other side, where and how the decisions are making, this is central when we talk about peace. And this is my comment for the panel.
Thank you first for all your sharing. It was really interesting. And during all the day, we were hearing a lot of things. And I think a few things got in my head that I found pretty similar in all the rounds that we had and all the talks that we had also during the summer school, that when we talk about the probable future, about the future, sometimes we look to it with a negative vision. We see something that we don't like to see. We see an announcement and marketing thing that we say like, oh, it's not the future that I want. But it's the future that we are walking to right now. And that always got me like, why we're walking to a future that we don't like, that we don't want to live. And when we see the main difference between the probable future and the desirable future is normally people. Like the main difference is how people act, is how people get the good nature, you know? All my desirable futures talked about, no, you don't need to worry about that because people are good in their nature. They don't need that. They're not fighting. We're not having problems. And we're talking about teaching future literacy and teaching peace and like taking that to the learning level. So I want to ask if you guys think that it's possible that we teach and that we transmit this knowledge of the human nature being good, because I see that we have a tendency to go into the bad side. And as you said, like the future is in our head. So if the future is in our head and our head is negative, how are we going to better future if we're just looking to the negative side of it? Thank you.
Thank you. So, why is it that we do what we do? What is the nature of humankind? That's not a small question. And the other is about war and marching forward to war. I'd like to open this to the panelists to respond to, but I think on this question about human nature, if you look into the literature, there's a lot of debates about what that contains. My personal perspective is we can do a lot of beautiful things, and we have amazing capacity to harm. So creating structures and systems that are able to guide us into the path where we are able to make better choices, I think is the idea behind responsible governing systems. That said, to come back to a point made earlier, I think a lot of people are tired. They have a lot to do, a lot of study, a lot of time spent with family, and people who are in large international organizations or in governments are often dealing with a lot of the fallout from the harm. And so I often wonder about, I think it's an opportunity for futurists to create a space for just a temporal suspension. As Fabio mentioned, take a deep breath. Let's try to work on these issues with this spirit of cooperation and building coalitions around shared values, which, as you mentioned, there's a lot of things that we share that we want to work toward. From my research looking at people who approached conflict violently or non-violently or mixed, something I noticed was that a lot of the devil was in the details. A lot of the bigger visions could be shared. Peaceful future, better future, shared future. But then when you ask, well, what does shared mean? Oh, we have to live next to each other. Oh, we have to go to the same school. Oh, we have to, when you get down into what do those bigger definitions mean, I think that is where a lot of the conflictual issues and the tensions and the energy of diplomats and negotiators go into kind of working through those kind of details when there's a large-scale peace process of some sort. But I think I'll contain my answer because I can talk for a long time. As for the other question, I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand what it was.
On the decision making, because when we talk about governance, we are talking who takes decisions.
Sure.
And how the decisions are made. And we can use the future to make better decisions. However, when we look the majority of documents about governance, the question is, society needs to be consulted and validated, but not part of the decision. The question here is how your vision about governance, because this table is about governance, where really people is part of the decision making. I think Claire maybe can start, because this is the point. Because when you look the documents of these different agencies, documents agree, but it's not there that really the society takes part of the decision.
So how is participation more than just a keyword? How is it actually that people are able to participate in a process and contribute to the decision making in a way that's more than surface level, but that's integrated? Sure. Claire, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that resonates. You know, when we were looking at issues around trust, we found that 50% of people trust their governments. So I think this is a clear indication that to have more trust, to feel that the government is responding to people's needs, we need to do things differently. There needs to be more of a participatory approach, but whereby citizens also see that the decisions are having an impact on their life. So at the United Nations, of course, we had the focus on future generations. And this has been translated into policy. So if we look, for example, at Wales and the Futures Generations Bill there, that is a direct example of how people have been consulted, how it has changed the governance system, and how it has changed policies. Australia is working on the same type of legislation. It hasn't passed yet, but they have organized themselves, consulting young people, trying to get people's input into this bill. This is something that we need to expand upon. This is also the purpose of the Global Anticipatory Policy Coalition. And I think this is also the purpose of the UN 80 reform. People want to see action. And UNESCO has a new DG. Now our slogan is UNESCO for the people. So we want to see the decisions impacting the people.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to
Maybe
share?
just remind us that, you know, again, courage, strategic courage is part of any exercise of foresight and governance, you know. And I just wanted to bring that to the debate because it's part of a condition. You know, the condition is to, you know, to have a courage to put in place decision. And sometimes we forget courage.
Are there any more audience questions?
Hello again. So it's not a question, but an advice. As students, how can we get involved in programs, policies? Like, you have a lot of experience, maybe be it in territorial experience or national experience or international experience. How can we get involved as students?
Okay, let's go. So my name is Vincenzo. Everyone that knows me knows that I like a lot to ask questions because they bring a lot of understanding, and that's why why I'm saying this in the beginning is that I feel like maybe the question or the provocation that I'm bringing is out of misunderstanding. So maybe I will educate myself, and if someone had the same misunderstanding, maybe it will help. So the thing is that got me confused is, if peace is the absence of conflict, and the conflict arises through the interactions of different objects, so like you guys had an idea, it caused me like an internal conflict in myself. I was not at peace with my doubts. Is the arrival of lasting peace to accept anything that comes? So my questions, I won't bother to ask. or to not have differences at all. And like maybe also end up being the question, should we actually talk about the futures of education for peace? Or since we want so many changes, what is the future of education for disruption? Because that's how we make changes, like disbalancing, like bringing out of the peace. Did it make sense? Yeah? Okay.
It made partial sense to me, but education for disruption, in order to prepare us. Yes, sorry. My apologies. There's another question.
Thank you very much for your insights. And my question goes particularly for Carine and Joshua. In academia, we are mostly working on interdisciplinary, right? So we are trying to create a dialogue among scientists and political scientists and economists and so on. And so the idea is fantastic. Then when we are trying to run projects on interdisciplinary issues, it's sometimes a nightmare. So I wonder, from your experience, how does it work in all the different issues and programs you are running now, and what type of advices, if it runs well, can you give us so that it can work properly and better in academia? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so I think what I heard was, what can students do? How should education be rethought so that it's more about disruption in order to create new or better futures? And the final one is, how do we deal with interdisciplinarity in the field of future studies and in large international organizations? Was that correct on the last one? Yes, thank you. Okay. Who would like to begin?
I think I can go quickly on Vincenzo's and come back a little bit to Thais as well. Beginning with Thais, I think it's very common that to make a big confusion between progress and evolution. We think of progress as something linear within a given paradigm. What you're talking about in terms of human nature, I think maybe that's where our next step in evolution lies. But evolution is not linear. So it goes in multiple directions. And I think we're really going to evolve. I think we started on the wrong foot when Linné called us Homo sapiens. When we become sapiens, we may have peace. And that would be the ultimate stage of evolution, I guess. And in your case, Vincenzo, I think what you're mentioning about conflict, Plato's dialectic goes on that a bit. His dialectic, differently from Hegel's, that's a dialectic about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, that you have to reach some kind of agreement. In case of Plato, he said that that dialectic is a therapy for the soul. It's something that you do to eliminate pathological ignorance. In other words, you talk to somebody else who may be super different one from the other. You look at, oh, that's very different. It causes this little conflict that you said. But you just respect this other viewpoint. You don't need to become the other guy. You don't need to reach some kind of synthesis. But your action should not overrule his. You know? So I like this idea of dialoguing, basically. And I think that it touches a little bit on this. Conflict, when it's democratic, is good.
So we're not talking about like peace to not... So we're not talking about peace of not having any sort of conflicts. We're probably talking about peace, about like not having major wars and this type of stuff. Yeah? And if so, even in these situations, can we truly like, I don't know, it's so polemic to ask like if there's any occasion that a war or violence can actually make a change. Like for people that, for example, suffer from abuse in their home, is like giving a push to the abuser, like
I'll just give you an example. There's an old song from the 70s, Talking Heads, when they say, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. It's not so good. So there's always some discussion and conflict, but that can build to be something positive out of it.
About this question of what kind of peace are we talking about? There's a lot of work that's been written, and I'm thinking of Johan Galtung. He differentiated between a peace that's the absence of war, so no one is physically dying, and peace researchers, they have a threshold for how many deaths equal a war. You know, it's there are more technical terms, which is sad to think about, but that's how research is done. And then there's the concept by Galtung of more positive peace, which is about, okay, a child has passed away, and it's not due to a war, it's due to a medication that is perfectly available in a different country, in a different context. And Galtung talks about that as a structural violence that's being done against the child. So the concept of peace is huge. It's nuanced. There are a lot of brilliant thinkers who have written about this. So I would recommend that if you have time, opportunity, and want to read more on these different definitions of peace, because it's like when you ask, what is time? And then suddenly you think about it, and it's an enormous subject. It's very passionate too, so.
I'll pick up the other two questions and roll them into one, if I may. Interdisciplinarity and what can we do as students? I ran the internship program at my previous employer, and when I took over, the overwhelming majority of our interns were Dutch or European from Dutch and European universities, studying political science in a political science institution, a think tank. And yet some of our brightest and best interns that I recruited turned out to be a startup entrepreneur from Germany and Nigeria, an engineer from India, and a pharmacist from Brazil. And part of why they were such fantastic team members was because they had interdisciplinarity built in. They had backgrounds that most of us didn't. They knew stuff that most of us didn't. And I was never afraid of being outshone by an intern who was reporting to me, because the whole reason for them being there was to do stuff that I wasn't able to, or bring knowledge that I didn't have. But also because they also knew that they were in an environment that was a bit different for them, that they wouldn't have all the right ideas right from the start, and that it was unreasonable for them to get top grades right from the start. And that's a little bit of a trap that we can fall into through our studies, that the reason we're there is to get good grades. The reason we're there is to get a good education. And this is something I tell my students, which is, if you don't have great ideas to begin with, have a few bad ideas. Start with that and run with them. Keep it moving, even when you're not ready. Put down what you've got on paper, and you can always improve it later. Your career doesn't come as a multiple choice questionnaire, where you can just pick the right answers and at the end get the result and hooray, you've succeeded. And it doesn't even come like a piece of IKEA flat pack furniture where the instructions are all laid out ready for you. It comes as just a kind of bunch of random stuff, and you want to make something of it. And the first few things you make of it probably are going to be bad. And that's okay. You have to do the steps to get through the steps. So by the end of a course with me, my students have stopped asking questions like, how many lines do we need to write? Or how many pages does this assignment need to be? And they're tuning into what is the purpose of the assignment that is before us, and how can we make something that's really valuable come out of this?
Thank you, Josh. Any other? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to pick up on the same too. So from the student's point of view, I'm not the right person to answer in terms of future-specific fellowships that might be out there, but certainly in biosecurity there are a number of short-term fellowships that often will be either a research project or just a kind of short course of getting to know people that you can go on if that's an interest to you. The same with AI safety. There's a huge amount now on AI safety, like basic training and fellowships. Yeah, if you're specifically interested in any of that, do talk to me afterwards and I'll pull out some proper examples. Interdisciplinarity. So on the positive side of my experiences in it, I was very lucky at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk that we had funders who really understood the importance of interdisciplinarity and were willing to fund that work. And certainly if you're working on any form of global challenge, there's no point in doing that within a single discipline. You're just missing out on so much. So that's the positive side, and also have had the very good experience in horizon scanning work with when it's done as a group and involving many different disciplines. But also I would throw in ones that we didn't think of. We got lucky in that we had a venture capitalist that turned out to be really good at scientists going, oh, that's 15 years time, and them going, we're funding that now. So that kind of thing was useful. Didn't involve lawyers or judges at all. And I heard a presentation recently from a judge, and I was like, that would be so useful. We need those people in. On the negative side, though, most funders, most academic research funders are still bounded within silos, or they'll get so far. So we had one lot of funding for developing a course for biosecurity for neuroscientists, and then said, right, we developed it, we'd like to test and evaluate it. And they said, well, that's not research, so we don't fund it. But similarly, even when I said we managed to get funding for interdisciplinary work, there aren't careers that have that interdisciplinary focus. So where do your researchers go once they've spent 3 to 5 years with you? So there's a need for change in the kind of structures in academia.
Thank you. Carine?
Yes, I wanted to say that congratulations, because I think the questions you propose and you arise are really philosophical questions. And maybe you know that Gaston Berger, who invented prospective in French, is a French philosopher. So among futurists, you have a lot of philosophers, and I invite you to read Bergson. And I was speaking about Hartmut Rosa, who discuss a lot the social acceleration, how we refer to time, etc. So I think it is wonderful because it's the meaning of life and it's the meaning of, you know, what you have to bring to life. And I think it's wonderful you question this question, you propose this question. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. You know, it's very strong for me to hear that. And then for you, lady, my answer to your question is engage yourself in democracy. I think you understand that we have to save democracy. We have to revitalize democracy, you know, whether it's with, when it relates to cognitive war, we didn't discuss that so much today, but, you know, deep fakes, you know, misinformation, go voting, engage, politically speaking, not such in a party, you know, partisan way, but, you know, really invest politically speaking in contributing to the future of society, whether in think tanks or journalism or whatever, you know, can revive democracy. We need democracy to be able to be free to imagine our futures.
Thank you. You wanted to add something, Claire?
I just wanted to come back to this issue of peace. And, you know, in our Constitution, UNESCO was founded, of course, in 1945 after World War II. And it says that we are founded to build the defenses of peace in the minds of men, because it is in the minds of men that wars begin. And I think this is a really important message for why we are doing futures thinking, why we are promoting anticipatory governance. And I think also just coming back to this Homo sapiens comment that you made, is going beyond this very anthropocentric view of the world to take into other concepts. One I really appreciate is James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, that seeing ourselves within the wider biosphere. And I think that's something that we need to think about as we look at changing socioeconomic paradigms, going beyond GDP, thinking about what progress means. And I'd just like to add that in addition to conflict, wars, we also have environmental conflicts. A lot of countries are now working on recognizing nature rights. So I think these are some other aspects in terms of peace that we should also take into account. And we also have a internship program at UNESCO. So you are also welcome to apply for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I wanted to add a last piece as well to the question about students. When I was at university, there were a lot of people working with NGOs and many different justice-related issues that came by. At some point as a student, I thought, it's too big, it's too much. There's so many different issues. There's so many different problems to get involved in. So I think the advice I'm giving is one I would have given myself as a student, and that was develop your critical thinking skills. So force yourself to read and to write. And to get involved in one or two issues that are really meaningful. So you've heard there are a lot of different opportunities. There's so many different pieces to the puzzle of trying to contribute positively in this world. So instead of being overwhelmed by the 20 or the 30 or the 50 things that you could get involved in, for this moment, find one or two, read about it, read what others have done, and volunteer, join an NGO, learn more. And I think that's a really powerful way to figure out what your aim could be. So, thanks. Any other comments before we close and turn over to Fabienne for this summary conversation? All right, well, thank you so much, panelists. You've been great. Thank you for your time.
Sense-making, wrapping up, by Fabienne GOUX-BAUDIMENT, that is a futurist, former president of the World Future Studies Federation, former president of the Société Française de la Prospective, and who was with us last week during the summer school, during the game of the poly crisis. So thank you very much, Fabienne, for being here, and thank you for this closing talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Well, I'm happy to see you still alive after such a long day. And I will try not to bother you too much. But I guess that, like me, you have been quite overwhelmed by the quality of the exchanges here and the fact that it was so rich and so diverse as well. So I took some 14 pages of notes. And of course, it's a bit difficult to synthesize them, but it is not, I don't want to make a resume. It's not about a summary. It's about trying to make sense of what we hear today, clearly. And so, first of all, and this is kind of a pedagogical lecture, sorry guys, again, but I need to clarify my own assumptions, which means my own compass. Because what I'm saying is not what an AI is saying, it's what a human is saying, which means that I interpret things that I hear, like you are doing yourself. And first of all, I use what we called, especially in foresight, where it is so useful, but also here, a reading grid. The reading grid is a way that you put the main key points of your thinking, and then you try to articulate everything thanks to those key points, okay? So I try to elaborate one before coming, thinking that it would help me to understand what would be said. And so I had two grids in mind. The first one was what capacities for peace, and the other one was what architecture for peace. Well, I have to say that at the end of the day, I cannot answer using these grids. So I had to find other ways to explain what I understand. But first of all, we need to lay down definitions, because without definitions, we cannot go further. We are just talking, but we need, and students, please, keep this in mind. First, before any kind of discussion, lay down definitions. This is really the key. And here, I try to put down what are my own definitions based on my knowledge. Maybe, no, you don't know that I'm a political scientist. I've been trained as such. Then I got my doctorate, my PhD in social sciences in foresight. So this is where I'm speaking from. And for centuries, we have had two ways to look at peace. The first one is that considering peace as a natural state of humanity. And behind this, you have Rousseau, for example, kind of a famous philosopher, Clausewitz as well. So this is the first approach. We are all very peaceful people, and conflicts are just something that from time to time break down. Fine. Another way of looking at peace is to consider that conflict is inherent to what we are as human societies. And in this case, peace is just something very fragile that we try to reach every day, every moment of our life. And behind this, you have Hobbes, for example, that I imagine you know, Sun Tzu as well, etc. So when I put this down, I wonder what kind of peace will we talk about? I mean, will we speak from the point of view of we are peaceful people, or we are just conflictual people? And so my question was, what is peace just beyond the simple absence of war? I will make it short, because I have not much time to go through. But the point is that today, we tend to think peace as something kind of part of us, as something that we have to protect. And what we are talking always about is war. War is happening here. War is now here, and so on. But okay, let's try to make the contrary. Take the opposite side and think that conflict is inherent to human people. So we are in a constant state of conflict. When you do so, then you have to imagine peace as an infrastructure of our development, of our progress that we have to develop. And so we are talking of a systemic peace, which is part of my work. And I want to make it short. Consider in this case peace as an emergent property of a resilient social system. And when you do so, peace is no longer a state to preserve, it is a system to cultivate. Peace is not the opposite of war, it is the outcome of a well-designed social system and institutions, by the way. And finally, peace is not acquired, it's a capability that societies have continuously to learn. Those are my definitions. Second point that can help us is to consider human as binary. We tend to think of us as good people or bad people. But come on, guys, look at yourself, look at your own story. Have you ever heard a bad thought about someone? Never think of killing someone? Really? Come on. If so, you would be holy people. And if some holy people are here, please stand up. We want to see you. We are not, of course, but we are not devil as well. We are just normal people. We is partly good and bad. That's it. This is our nature. So just face it and see how we can cope with it. The fact is that not only we are binary ourselves, and we have these two sides, like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but also we have different cultural archetypes. In some archetypes, like I'm a man, I'm a warrior, I'm the superhero, it is very different from the guy who is, I'm humble, I'm modest, I'm just trying to contribute to peace. Same thing for a woman. It is not about man and woman. It is not a gender thing. It's about archetypes. Archetypes of the concurrent, archetype of the victim, archetype of whatsoever. So first of all, let's recognize archetype. Second thing is cultural paradigm. Do you know the difference between a paradigm and a worldview? But we talk a lot about worldview and paradigm today. So the worldview is personal. This is the way when you were, let's say, 18 months old, so really a baby, you begin to sort out the information related to the world. And the worldview is the way you install a reading grid in your mind to just read the world, understand the world. The paradigm is a broader view which has been elaborated, let's say, and given to you by your society, the society you are living in, your culture. This is a broad frame, okay? And considering this, each of us with our different worldviews, cultural archetype and cultural paradigms, we have different lenses to look at the world and to understand how the world is evolving, okay? So for some people, peace is something impossible to achieve, and for others, it's a normal thing. For some people, conflict is just an easy and normal thing. We talk about normalization. And for others, it is just unbearable. And we have to accept this. But we have also to accept that peace not only is very large, as April stated, but also it's a matter, it's a fact of a civilization. I know that the word civilization is not very well used today, but still think of it as, let's say, a specific culture developed at a certain moment of time with very structural aspects. And you have different civilizations, from Caral to Moriori, for example, who are more peaceful than others, which means that it is possible to develop a rather peaceful society. Then, the fact is that when you analyze the Western civilization, it is based on competition, as we mentioned, individualism, more or less selfishness, and a clear lack of empathy, which led us to colonization and other things like that. Right now, we are living in what I would call an hegemony civilization, based on the fact that a certain part of the world is hegemonic and conveying hegemonic values as well. And the most interesting thing, perhaps, is when you look at the popular culture, such as television series or things like that, you can see that you have a lot of images, and it was pointed out, of destruction, death, violence. How can you interpret it? Is it just a sign of decadence, as so many people would do, especially in peace literature? Or is it a way for you, for your generation, guys, to face this dark side of our nature and prepare yourself to face it in your life? That's a question. I have no answer, but you can try to find a solution. And we mentioned patriarchy. You remember? I think it was Tanya. And patriarchy is about that. For a while, patriarchy was something really good. And now we are looking in the eyes of patriarchy, and we are finding that maybe we can change this model as well. So, to connect the dots and try to understand this personal and collective transformative journey that we had today, I would say that instead of bringing you some different dots, I will present you 4 main, how can I say, steps in the journey of building peace. The first is know yourself. Recognize who you are as a human being in terms of mindset and in terms of collective psychology, as Josh mentioned. Recognize your own biases, your worldview, your paradigms. Consider that you are equally fit for violence and for love. And like yin and yang, this is part of you. And recognize also what kind of conditions will trigger in you your will to act in a violent way or in conflictual way. And you know very well that every day you do so, by the way you address someone, by the words you use, by any kind of thing. Consider that. Then, about a specific issue, know the facts. Facts and facts, definition and facts, always. Share the definition, state the facts. The facts you know, and the facts you can prove. Then already you deflate a little bit the conflict because you base your assumptions on something that can be proven. Then be aware of the real weight of the risks. We mentioned a lot of risk from planetary boundaries, biotech, pandemics, and so on. So, okay, the risks are here. But the point is that we know perfectly the risk. And especially your generation, because you are very anxious about those risks. And you're right. But the thing is, the risks are there. Now you need to weight them. And again, this is a scientific process. Wait. What really worse, you mentioned, for example, how to be involved in. Okay, what kind of risk you fear the most? Huh? Fear of? Failure. Okay, so what can you do to avoid the risk of failure? Exactly. And you can do this for absolutely everything. Which means that once you know the risk, when you are able to elaborate on this risk and to weight the risk really, then you can act. And you can also develop critical thinking, which is really deep into foresight, in order to work against post-truth, fakeism, we mentioned this also, manipulative narratives, because you remember that we talk about narratives, but narratives are also manipulative. They are not always good. It's just a tool, and a tool can be used for good and bad. And also to prevent common preconceptions, because so often they are at the roots of conflicts. Okay, so you know yourself, you know your biases, you know the facts. Now, try to learn to express yourself. Once you have been in, so let's move to out. How can you express your argumentation? You do not agree with someone? Okay, that's fine. How can you express yourself? Can you use the words, the tones, the way of being, your body language even, to communicate in a non-violent way? Can you develop some humility to be aware that you do not know everything and that you can learn from the other as the others can learn from you. How can you be aware of others' cultural lenses? As we talk, we are all different, we have all different lenses. How can you learn? How can you phrase, rephrase, reframe what the others are saying and try to clarify what you're talking about? And last but not least, how to remember to, how can you balance between what it means to be human and what it takes to be human. And it is not the same thing at all. Can you also balance your energy in such a way that all the negative energy you put in a conflict, you could deflate it and transform it in something positive that could make you happy instead of just going to cry in your corner because the conflict is too heavy for you? Well, it's so important to develop this interface between you and the others. And finally, the fourth one is clarify your values. Behind everything, behind the way you behave, behind what you express, behind any kind of assumptions, you will always find values. And in Foresight, we have two major values which are our legs in this field. The first one is humanism. Humanism is a philosophy mostly about the fact that human beings can do good things, can shape a better future, that the future is not determined, and so we can act upon it, is that human agency is a key to do things, and if we do things together, it's even better, and we can really act even better. And finally, to listen to stakeholders, because when you do something, it is not for yourself. It is always for someone else. And so, who is the someone else? We used to call it a stakeholder, but what does it mean? It means that this is someone that we use what you are doing for them, that will benefit or no, or not from it. And you have to be very, very thoughtful about that, because you never know how the end user will benefit or not of what you are devising. And especially in education, for example. And this gentleman, Richard, I think, was talking about disruption in education. So the real disruption in education will be when students will be part of the program elaborations. This would be disruption. Now, the second leg on which we are working as well is universalism. The word was not pronounced, really, but it was mentioned several times about common values that most of humanity could share. This is what is universalism. The thing is that universalism is so often colored, tinted by colonialism, intellectual colonialism, imperialism, hegemony, call it as you want. But behind this, if you go back to the original myth of humanities, on all the continents, you will find some real common values. And we can call them universalism, and especially the sensitivity of human beings everywhere in the world to ethics and to justice. So the first conclusion of these 4 steps is that you can work efficiently into peace and conflict, and especially and conflict, not one without the other, through and by your acts. You remember when we play together, it was already about acting, about agency, because you have this power. And no one on earth can take this away from you. This is your superpower as the hero of tomorrow. So keep this in mind. I would like just to conclude with 2 stories, real life stories, because we talk about a lot of concepts, a lot of people who are dead now, so that's fine. And I love Johan Galtung that I met, and people look like Elise Boulding and so on, but just this is no longer their world. It's a different world, even if more of their ideas are still good. So let me just make short story, long stories short, with 2 missions. Well, 1 mission I did in Colombia in the early 2000s. I was called to bring people who hated each other around the table. We had people from the coffee industry, people from the drugs cartels, army, paramilitary, guerrilla people, well, this kind of people. They came to the meeting with guns, and you can imagine that it was kind of difficult. And the idea was that it was impossible for them to talk about the present. And it was impossible for them to talk about their own futures. So we transfer all the conversation on their children. Saying, okay, we want to talk about Colombia right now. We want to talk about you right now. Not even about you in the future, but let's talk about your children. And you cannot imagine, during 2 days, these people said incredible things. And only one verbatim that I would like to tell you or share with you is one of the drug cartel boss, very well known at the time, now in jail. He said, well, the future of my children, I want my children to go to university, to become engineers, go into a good bank or a good company. And I don't want them to live in a world with drug. I said, okay, you are the boss of a drug cartel, and you say that for the future of your children, you do not want drug around. You are killing yourself. And he told us that the story of his life was a story of being young, being in a mafia, and then from a mafia to another one, and then progressing inside because this was his only way of survival. But that his world was so constrained and so violent and so not a happy world, I would say, that he didn't want this for his children. And this is, I think, a good way of thinking about violence, about people who are violent, who are guilty. I'm not saying that we have to forget everyone and say the world is wonderful, and no. But what I'm saying is that begin to ask people what they want for their children, and you will discover a new world emerging. And a world in which stories of the past won't last anymore. My second point is about a school in France, Les Écoles des Amanins, which is in the south of France. And this is the only school, at my knowledge, using education for peace in the primary school. And what they do for this is so simple, it's so just incredible. I saw it by myself, and really it's just wonderful, it's amazing. I mean, every week, at the end of, the Friday evening, something like that, all the people convene in a big hall, and all the students, the pupils who have had a way of litigate any kind of conflict during the week will isolate themselves in some part of the room. The others will move all around, chanting at very, very slow noise, but just to make a kind of a white noise around, so that you cannot hear people discussing between themselves, and they will explain each other why they litigated. Not the reason why, but how they perceive it, how they suffer from it, how they just didn't comprehend what was happening. And I can really tell you that the way that the young people are transformed, it's just absolutely impressive. Because they learn to talk to each other, to talk about their emotion, and to talk about the way they understand, they get empathy with the other. And this is really something that is happening and that is working. So what we talk all along the day are not only theories and ideas, but also real things that happen and work. And it was what I wanted to tell you. I will conclude with the need for foresight. As a futurist, I cannot tell anything else, of course. Foresight is about humanism, as we said, values, no determinism, unconditional love, that was said, better and desirable futures that are always possible, critical thinking to avoid to fuel conflict. It's also about system analysis, which means that when you understand the consequences of your act, you can better act. It's about risks anticipation, analysis, and preparedness as well. It's also about advanced anticipatory capacities to develop anticipatory governance, anticipatory innovation, anticipatory design, agency, action, problem solving. Everything revolves to the future. So I would say that welcome the difference. You are all here from different countries, different cultures. You have an extraordinary chance to be here. It's just wonderful that you can be here. You are very lucky. And I hope that you really will enrich yourself through this difference and be able to go back home carrying with you all what you learn here, especially from the others. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you, Fabienne. I would like to thank everybody for being here today. I would like to thank the speakers for accepting the invitation, the students for being here, the people that came to watch it here in person, or those that are at home watching it online. I would like to again stress how much this first event is very important for our UNESCO chair, and like a very important milestone, because this is the first event where we can set the, let's say, the scene, what we want to do in the coming 4 years. I'd like to thank the direction of our faculty, our dean, for the amazing support that you had, like for the chair and for this program. I'd like to thank you, all the L3P production, for being here and adapting every time that you had a request. And I would like to thank you as well, all the staff and the team from our faculty that worked a lot behind the scenes to make this summer school and this conference to happen. So thank you again. I invite you, all the presenters and the public, to go the next room for the cocktail, and the students please remain for our certificate ceremony. Thank you.